Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest webinar in our Return to Work series. Today, we're going to be talking about how to best leverage space booking, occupancy, and environmental data when introducing hybrid working. My name is David Atwell-Thomas. I've been a member of the OpenSensors team for just over 2 years now, and it's been very interesting in my time here to see what has changed in kind of workplace strategy and the world of the workplace. First off, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of what we're going to cover today. Firstly, we're going to look at what trends and patterns are kind of emerging around the world in response to COVID-19. And then we're going to look at the challenges that introducing hybrid working poses to HR, facilities, and senior leadership teams. And then finally, the kind of main meat of the presentation will be looking at the role of occupancy, booking, and environmental data in safely bringing employees back into the office and kind of managing their experience within hybrid environments. The main presenter in today's webinar is our CEO and founder, Judith Stanton. So I'll hand over to her now to briefly introduce herself, give a little background information on what OpenSensors do and what we've seen happening over the course of the pandemic. So over to you, Judith.
Hi everyone, thank you for your time today. As David mentioned, my name is Judith. I'm a technologist and run OpenSensors. OpenSensors, essentially we provide sensor solutions for the built environment, for particularly offices. We help people understand environmental information and utilization information, and in terms of what we do, we roll out sensor networks, gather the data, and help people understand the data. The pandemic has brought in some interesting challenges for our customers. So we've been really thinking through how we help our clients and providing a space for information and learning, because a lot of what people are seeing is uncharted waters for most of you. And essentially, what kind of the structure that we use is really taking what we're learning both from the customers that we're supporting. Some of them have worked through the pandemic because they're essential services and they've worked in their offices through the pandemic and through the various lockdowns, and others are creating, and now a lot of people are in execution mode in terms of their return to work programs.
So first things first, I think to kind of give a bit more context to what you were just talking about, it'd be great if you could highlight what trends are emerging globally as businesses are trying to reopen in terms of kind of expectations and space design.
Yeah, I think the obvious statement is it's obviously remote work to some degree is here to stay. Surveys after survey has shown majority of employees, I think 90+% of people want to keep a degree of flexibility, the majority preferring 2 to 3 days work from home. This is consistent across regions and industries and so forth. What the pandemic has shown to kind of in the cultural shift is that a lot of people can adequately work from home, and it's not a problem. So I think we all agree, and the basis is we can't go back to 5 days a week in the office, and we won't be going back to that. And the industry itself is asking fundamental questions around what is the purpose of the office, and it's led to an acceleration, I would say, of a trend that's been around for a while, which is activity-based working. The basic concept of activity-based working is that it is the job of the organization, the employer, to provide space to work for different types of work styles. And these can vary quite a bit between people, work styles and also work preferences. The space, the office, has to be fit for purpose rather than necessarily cookie cutter. And around activity-based working comes also a lot of trust and empowerment to the people using the space, and trusting people to figure out how to best be productive and catering for their circumstances. So I guess that's the one side, which is the behavior and expectation side. The other side is which is very new, is the kind of what does it take to make the space safe. People are highly aware of the viruses, and what is it that we need to do to assure people and also make it actually safe. And well-being is no longer kind of a nice to have on the agenda, and being quite scientific about the way we create these healthy indoor environments. And later on, I'll take you much more specifically into what this means.
Next up, getting a bit more kind of specific, talking about the challenges that these changes will pose. If you could kind of briefly summarize the main areas that teams will need to be addressing in order for these hybrid environments to be successful, that'd be some very useful background.
So whilst the hybrid working environment, I think consistently is agreed that it's better for people, I think it's a much more challenging environment for organizations to get right. So there's three main challenges. The first one is around allocation of space. I think is quite critical that workplace teams, they need to control capacity as they phase people back. And this is not just monitoring it passively as perhaps has been done before, but also really actively managing capacity. And capacity, keeping in mind that capacity can go up and down, or maximum capacity can go up and down over time. I think COVID is going to be around for a while. So assuming from a kind of business planning standpoint that capacity might have to come down as after it reopens. And this is where I think booking can definitely help. Booking systems and technologies can, make it easy for people to access spaces they need and also release spaces that are unused. Otherwise, it's going to be a hugely manual task that will involve a lot of people passing information around via emails and so forth. The second is, safety, again, well-being being the primary concern, and reduction of transmission of viruses and what it means to create a healthy building. I think that's a big challenge that is new to most. This includes obviously environmental, the social distancing side, the contact tracing side, and anyone that is managing an indoor environment really has now new responsibilities that they need to ensure that the space is safe. The third is, managing the strategy going forward. What does the strategy need to look like? Hybrid working, there are a lot of unknowns for most, and we know what people are saying with their preferences. Now, the question that is unknown is whether their behavior will tie into what their stated preferences are, and we have to see that in reality, and we have to monitor that. So, from what I kind of see is organizations need to be much more data driven around their portfolio strategy as a whole. And I'll take you through some practical examples on how people are solving these challenges. So one example that we really are quite opinionated about is around booking data and the kind of the interlinking between booking information and occupancy information. I think neither one or the other doesn't really address the whole of the problem. The problem is addressed by the balance of controlling capacity, automating the small rotation of assets. And that really means kind of understanding booking versus actuals, releasing assets if there are no shows, and automating a lot of those and adding a layer of policy above it. Cleaning crews will need to understand where the busy areas are. And effectively, we also need to make it very, very easy for people to find spaces. And it's a huge waste if people have to walk around and try to find appropriate space. We need to make it super easy and take that distraction away. I think when it goes wrong, that side is hugely disruptive to the organizations. But when it works, it should be seamless and just completely efficient and behind the scenes.
That builds on quite nicely from, I don't know if anyone here was in our webinar last month with Sue and Emma, when they were talking about just because we're trying to enable people to work freely and move freely within a space doesn't mean that it can be a free-for-all, especially given the safety concerns. We need a case of building a framework in which people can move freely as safely as they can. But the decisions on how people can do that need to be evidence-based. And building on what you just mentioned about finding spaces, this data can also play a role in ensuring that the right spaces themselves are there. Well, anyway, you could shed some light on that.
Again, it's two sides. I think that the way we think about the return to work strategy is in phases. So phase one is very much about people that are using the office, the essential workers that are coming in. They've always been there for most organizations. Phase two is very much around people that are really struggling at home. And there's, for every organization, both from what I understand internally for us, and also for all organizations that we speak to, there's a group of people that are just not enjoying working from home for very different reasons due to personal circumstances. And phase two has to really concentrate on those people and really give them the space they need. And then phase three can be everyone else, but really managing that return to work process so that the people that really need the space have it is fairly critical.
Should we talk a little bit about mobility profiles?
The second kind of example is around mobility profiles, and we use it a lot internally and with our clients. And this is often where I think people get the activity-based working implementation a little bit wrong, or at least kind of not thinking about it in the right way. Often what we see is person to desk ratios are quite top-down driven. I think it needs to be much more nuanced. There's always going to be a group of people, whether they're the essential workers that I mentioned before, or a group of people that are very heavy desk users, and they really need fixed desks. There's no point, moving them around in a hoteling style. But there are going to be sections of quite large percentage of the employees or the desk users that are now going to be very much part-time. And you can start using by categorizing between different types of desk users, you can start then looking at their patterns of behavior and really kind of identifying based on either a neighborhood or a floor or even a building, the person to desk ratios based on usage data, rather than necessarily just going, okay, we're going to use, we're going to have 2-to-1 person to desk ratio and that's it, without necessarily kind of analyzing the underlying information.
So those profiles can be like quite drilled down into. We can do by role, by department. It really helped to forecast space by understanding who you currently have and how they're working, like unlocks the full potential of your building a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, we think of it as much more looking at the asset. And I think the kind of at a high level, you have the fixed desk, which is the really heavy desk users. You have then people coming in part of the week. And then you need to kind of, you can start playing around with the rotations between teams. Mm-hmm. And then you just have people that are highly mobile that might come in once a month and so on. And having a small amount of touchdown spaces for that group of people, I think is the kind of the right context. The other context is this behavior will have changed significantly pre and whatever the post-pandemic is, right? The kind of it's not going to be the same as what we've known before. Okay, so we're going to drill in a little bit into detail because I think this is quite critical information that people need to have. So over the past since last March, effectively, we've been really looking at a lot of the research, and we tried to synthesize research from probably about 100 or more academic papers and consensus around what healthy indoor environments mean. And what we're synthesizing it into is 3, I think, cornerstones of information. So the first one is around the strength of the virus. So if you look at the virus survivability part, effectively what that means is how strong is the virus in the indoor environment. What the consistency is with peer-reviewed papers and so on is the biggest impact to virus strength is relative humidity and temperature. So dry air and cold air makes the virus stronger. Keeping relative humidity between 40 to 60% decreases the virus strength by about 70%. It's a really critical piece of information. And same with temperature. Well, not the same amount of impact, but cold air, dry air makes a huge impact. And that's why we're seeing huge kind of outbreaks within meat packing centers and so on, because these are cold, dry environments. Mm-hmm. The second cornerstone is what affects the immune system. So the factors that immune system health is negatively impacted by is, again, relative humidity, dry air, cold air. In addition to that, particulates, so polluted air that has high levels of particulate matter within the air vents is affecting people's immune system so that they get sicker. The third cornerstone is the amount of exposure. Now, amount of exposure means basically how much virus are you exposed to, and the more people are exposed to, the sicker they get. And essentially, the simplest thing is, open windows and get lots of fresh air. So you see a lot of kind of a huge decrease outdoors versus indoors and so on. And what we're using for that part is CO2. And CO2, when people come into an office during a working day, you see CO2 is quite low. And as occupancy increases and time increases, as people are kind of breathing out more, there's a buildup of CO2 that happens within an indoor environment. And the higher the buildup, the worse the kind of the air circulation is. So CO2 and occupancy impact how much fresh air should be pumped into that space. So you see, the German government is encouraging schools to open their windows once an hour and so forth within an office environment where a lot of this stuff is determined by the BMS. Monitoring CO2 and then increasing the airflow, the amount of airflow matters quite a bit. And these are the three things that really kind of make an indoor environment, better or worse for people from a virus standpoint.
It's kind of important, though, I think, to not look at occupancy data and environmental data separately, but instead to try and find patterns as you're bringing people back and trends of how the actual health of the building is impacted as occupancy changes. And you can then use the patterns between the two, to adjust your policy going forwards, fine tune the rules of how people do access the space to make sure it's most safe. It's not just like a CO2's got high, everybody go home. It's more of a long-term planning thing.
Indeed. And I think this is going to be critical not just for COVID, but for other viruses as well. I think that knowing these kind of cornerstones, then people can be quite demanding from their building provider, or if they control their BMS, kind of upping the air intakes. It's very much driven by what's going on in the building rather than the timers that are being set, which quite often the BMS systems are. It's kind of 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, you get a pump of fresh air, but not necessarily driven by what's going on in the building.
Something you mentioned, I think quite in passing there, was people are going to be quite demanding. We've been looking at a lot of surveys, and there have been like the overwhelming consensus is that people don't feel like they should be asked to go back to the office until they can be assured that it's safe. And that seems fair enough. How do you see this impacting businesses, the way that they have to communicate to their employees and in attracting talent as well? Like, do you think this is going to become a way that they have to kind of convince people that they're doing well and actually action it as well?
100%. I agree with you. I think all of us as individuals, our standards have gone up massively. Things we were blasé about before, we're not so much anymore, right? A lot of this kind of groundwork has been done by people like the World Building Standards and others. And so that kind of initial drive to really show that we really care about people's productivity and well-being has been started. So we're building on a lot of knowledge that exists already. And yeah, it demonstrates that, we care about the well-being of our employees. And I've talked about CO2 from a virus standpoint, but there's a huge impact on people's cognitive load from high CO2 levels. So, you might have a beautiful office that's not well ventilated, or your very kind of highly skilled people are not able to function as they should, and they don't feel well within themselves. So there's many kind of other areas that it impacts. I know that because we're talking about COVID now, we're staying in a specific lane, but this is highly important. And that, I think it's about time that I think the wellness agenda came up much higher in organizational kind of, or at least the focus is there now, which is really positive.
It does seem to be part of kind of a growing trend in a way of employees showing their willingness and like their ability to adapt throughout the pandemic. People just accepting that I now work from my bedroom and that's okay. There seems to be kind of this expectation of reciprocity in, you now have a responsibility to keep us safe, but like, we've proven that we can do this from home. It's now your turn to support us in how we want to work.
And the kind of that's kind of goes back to the question of what is the office for in the first place, right? If you have a desk at home and you're quite happy at your desk at home, what is the purpose? And again, the surveys show that the majority of people, why they want to go back is for collaboration, because and the social side. So it's the nature of the office, the shape and the design of the office, I think, will radically be transformed over the coming decades, which will be an interesting trend to watch for sure.
Design of the office itself, that is something that, again, can't be left down to guesswork. If we do get to a position where people are thinking critically about how they engage with the office and how they come in and what they come in for, the risk posed by them not being able to find the space that they require is a significant one. So leveraging data to make sure that that doesn't happen must be critical, right?
Yeah, indeed. I think, and we've probably heard about instances where, you know, people create an activity-based working, but they've underscoped what was necessary, and it just causes all sorts of disruption. Like I've seen examples where people have to come in super early to actually get a chance of getting a desk. Is counterproductive to what they intended on doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think the kind of the underlying data part, because getting it wrong is hugely disruptive, and it's very, very hard to undo. So yeah, the drumbeat of, you know, being data driven is that's really the hill that I'm kind of advocating for.
Just to quickly summarize kind of our key points before we try to get to some of your questions. First off, health and safety, it needs to be priority number one for pretty much every team involved in bringing employees back to the office. And hopefully you understand a bit more now how to combine booking, occupancy, and environmental data to create the safest framework, which can then flex to meet the changing demands of, like, I guess just seasonality and stuff could have an impact on it as well. But it's this flexibility which kind of needs to run throughout the entire framework and strategy. And that could go from, as the next point says, changing demands in space, making sure that you've got the right spaces for your employees to be using, and even a step further to the actual amount of total space you need. Like at the moment, as Yoda said, it's complete guesswork. No one really knows what's going to happen. Like, we need the data to inform those decisions. We need to be making the most of our real estate, and wasteful expansions kind of need to be a thing of the past. And finally, the importance of workplace booking systems, not only from an employee experience perspective, in terms of actually accessing and getting to the spaces they require, but in terms of then re-informing on the policy and the guidelines that you have in place to make sure that capacity isn't overrun, and that the teams who properly need the space can access it first. I think that's really important and probably can't be overstated too much. So just to finish off with, we've got a couple of questions that have come through. What are some of the best things you've seen happening when introducing hybrid working?
Some organizations that have really got it right have been, what they have done is declare their long-term policy. So some organizations have said, I think there's probably some headliners that come to mind, but they've said, you know what, if you don't want to ever come into the office, that's fine. That this is a policy, you can work from home for forever. So, and then probably ones that are not hitting the headlines as such have been also clear, you know, we require you to be in the office, you know, a minimum of 1 or 2 days a week, and that's going to be our policy. And I think that's a huge positive, because it gets people out of this waiting status mode, and people can plan what their lives need to look like, whether it's moving or you know, just what they will need over the next year. I think the biggest kind of probably mental hardship has been for a lot of employees is just this waiting stage where not knowing, and it's in lockdown, you don't know how long you're going to be and so forth. I mean, I'd encourage most people that are watching this, or as they're in their committees, is to really kind of step back and formulate the plan and let people know. We think we know, we've got some dates on when return to work is going to be, but we don't necessarily know the exact dates, but we should let people plan their lives.
Is there a benchmark space requirement per person for office reopenings?
I believe, I can't remember off the top of my head. There is. I think it's about 16 square meters or something like that per person.
Yeah. It goes back to the flexibility again. There's not going to be a one size kind of fits all solution to this. It's going to depend on what's happening in the world at the time and how severe things get and how your employees actually want to behave. And it's more about creating a flexible enough environment that you can adjust as you need to, instead of kind of, like you said, moving away from just, we're going to do 2 to 1 and that's it. We've got to be more on our feet, quick on our feet than that nowadays.
We're going to have 100 desks for 100 employees. with 2 meeting rooms, because that's what we always do, and some phone booths, it is not really going to cut it anymore. I think there'll be, this is my opinion, but based on some of the data, it looks like there's going to be much more demand on collaborative spaces. We don't really know how many, like for a group of people or for a neighborhood, we don't know how much more collaborative spaces we'll need, but that is definitely a trend. The trend is to have less desks, but like much more social working environments, whether it's booths or other types where people can brainstorm and so forth. So there's no longer kind of a norm. I think we're starting from scratch in terms of behavior and needs, which is quite exciting, because we can be, we can look at the behaviors, the user needs, and really create quite interesting designs going forward. So it's in that sense, it's quite exciting.
Well, that is all we've got time for this afternoon. I'd like to thank you all for your time, and I hope you all have a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.